The training ground was silent except for the sound of boots striking the gravel. Hundreds of soldiers stood in formation under the burning afternoon sun. Then from the back a sharp voice broke the silence. "Hey, Sergeant! What happened to your chest? Lose a fight with a bomb?" The laughter that followed was short-lived. Every pair of eyes turned toward the woman he mocked. Sergeant Emily Carter, a decorated combat medic whose scars told a story of sacrifice. 30 seconds later, when the truth about those scars came out, 400 soldiers snapped to attention, their hands rising in a salute that would change the life of that mocking SEAL forever. The desert sun bore down mercilessly on the military base, turning the air into shimmering waves of heat. The rhythmic sound of boots striking gravel echoed across the open field, where 400 soldiers stood in formation. Dust rose beneath their heels, mingling with sweat, determination, and pride. At the front of the field stood Sergeant Emily Carter, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. Her uniform sleeves were rolled neatly to the elbows, revealing faint scars trailing down her forearms. They were old, pale, and silent reminders of a past few dared to ask about. She wasn't just another instructor. She was the only female combat medic to ever lead joint training sessions between Army and Navy SEAL units, a position that required more than skill. It required respect, and respect Emily had earned the hard way. Today's exercise, she began, her voice firm but calm, is about endurance, teamwork, and composure under pressure. You will fail if you think strength is measured by muscle alone. Out here, mental control wins battles. A murmur rippled through the SEAL ranks, tough men, battle-hardened and proud. Among them stood Lieutenant Jake Walker, a tall, confident SEAL in his early 30s, his smirk barely hidden beneath his sunglasses. Jake had heard rumors about Emily before, stories of heroism, scars, and a battlefield gone wrong. But like many, he didn't believe them. As the soldiers began their drills, Emily moved among them, correcting posture, calling out commands. Her voice carried both authority and grace. But Jake, ever skeptical, watched her carefully. He leaned toward another SEAL beside him and muttered, "They said she's the Iron Angel or something. Doesn't look like it to me." The other SEAL gave him a warning glance. "Careful, Walker. She's earned that name," Jake chuckled. "Sure, probably from paperwork." A few nearby soldiers shot him sharp looks, but he didn't care. His pride as a SEAL made him believe no one could truly understand battle the way his unit did. Especially not someone who looked as calm as Emily Carter. The session continued until the temperature peaked, the air thick with exhaustion. Sweat dripped down faces. Lungs burned. Emily called for a break. She removed her outer vest to demonstrate a breathing technique for recovery. As she lifted the vest over her head, the edge of her undershirt shifted slightly, revealing faint, jagged scars along the upper part of her chest. For a moment, silence lingered until Jake's voice cut through it. "Well, now we know why she wears the long sleeves and armor so tight," he said loudly enough for several soldiers to hear. "Guess battlefield fashion leaves marks, huh?" A few chuckles escaped from the back, but they died quickly as heads turned toward him in disbelief. Emily froze for a heartbeat. Her eyes met Jake's across the field. He expected anger, maybe even a verbal takedown. But instead, she simply adjusted her vest back into place, her expression unflinching. "Lieutenant Walker," she said, her tone calm. So calm it unsettled everyone around her. 10 extra laps, now." Jake's smirk faltered. "For what, a joke?" 10 laps, she repeated, eyes locked on his. "Now." The silence grew heavy. No one dared to move. The commanding officer, Colonel Harris, stood watching from the edge of the field, his jaw tight. Even he didn't interfere. Jake hesitated, but the quiet around him was louder than any order. He dropped his canteen, squared his shoulders, and started running. Dust kicked up beneath his boots. Every few seconds, his glare flickered toward Emily. But she had already turned away, instructing others as if nothing had happened. When he finished the laps, sweat pouring, chest heaving, he found her still there, clipboard in hand, calling out times, correcting form, encouraging teamwork. She didn't look his way once. That indifference stung more than punishment ever could. As the sun began to set and training wrapped up, the soldiers gathered near the field tents, talking in hushed tones. A few SEALs shot Jake looks of disappointment. One of them, Corporal Ramos, finally stepped forward. "Walker, what you did today was out of line," Ramos said. "You don't know her story. And you don't mock scars in this camp ever, Jake frowned. What, we can't joke anymore? Everyone's so uptight. Ramos cut him off sharply. Those scars saved lives, Jake blinked. What's that supposed to mean? Ramos's gaze hardened. You'll find out soon enough. Later that evening, the training field was empty except for Emily. She stood alone under the dim floodlights, finishing her notes on the day's drills. The faint desert wind rustled through her hair. She could still hear the echo of Jake's words replaying in her mind, but she wasn't angry. Not anymore. She had heard worse before, on the battlefield, from pain from herself. She placed her clipboard down and touched the edge of the scar along her collarbone. For a moment, she closed her eyes and remembered the explosion, the blinding flash, the deafening blast, the screams of the men trapped inside the vehicle. She had dived in without thinking, shielding a wounded Marine with her body as shrapnel tore through her gear. She had survived, but the marks never faded. Neither did the memories. A voice broke through her thoughts. Sergeant Carter? She turned. It was Colonel Harris. The older man's face was lined with fatigue and quiet respect. You handled that well today, he said. Could have written him up. You didn't. Emily shook her head. He's young. Arrogant, maybe. But I've seen that before. The battlefield humbles everyone eventually. The colonel gave a faint smile. It will. Sooner than he thinks. He paused, then added, Tomorrow morning we'll tell them. All of them. It's time they understand who you really are. Emily hesitated. I don't want a spectacle. It won't be one, Harris said quietly. It'll be a lesson. He left her there under the fading light, and Emily looked out over the empty training field, the same ground where hundreds would stand tomorrow. Somewhere deep inside, she hoped that when the truth came out, it would not humiliate Jake, but transform him. Because true courage, she knew, wasn't about medals or recognition. It was about understanding pain and rising above it. That night in the barracks, Jake lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling. The laughter he'd caused earlier now echoed in his ears like shame. He didn't understand why the others looked at him the way they did, or why his chest tightened every time he remembered her eyes, calm yet fierce, when she said, 10 laps now. He turned onto his side, frustrated, unaware that the next day would shatter everything he thought he knew about her, about scars, about bravery, and about what it truly meant to wear the uniform. The next morning dawned with a soft orange glow spreading across the desert horizon. The air was cooler, and the mood around the base was quieter than usual. Word of yesterday's incident had spread through the ranks like wildfire. Every soldier seemed to know what had happened. The joke, the punishment, the silence that followed. But what none of them knew was what Colonel Harris had planned for that morning's assembly. Lieutenant Jake Walker arrived at the field early, trying to ignore the glances that followed him. A few nodded curtly, others simply turned away. Even his closest teammates from the SEAL unit avoided conversation. The confidence that usually fueled him had drained overnight, replaced with a dull sense of unease. He tried to shake it off. It was just a joke, he muttered under his breath. No big deal, but deep down he knew it was. At 800 hours sharp, the loudspeakers crackled to life. All personnel report to the parade field. Full formation. Within minutes, hundreds of soldiers assembled in precise rows, standing shoulder to shoulder beneath the morning sun. At the front stood Sergeant Emily Carter, her expression calm, clipboard in hand, and beside her Colonel Harris, the base commander. Jake stood somewhere near the middle, his gaze fixed on the back of Emily's uniform. Even from behind, she radiated a quiet authority he couldn't ignore. When the colonel stepped forward, the chatter ceased instantly. Good morning, Harris began. Yesterday, an incident occurred that reminded me how little we sometimes know about the people standing beside us in uniform. Today, before we begin drills, I want to tell you a story. He looked toward Emily, who gave a faint nod. It's about a combat medic named Emily Carter, Harris continued, his voice firm but emotional. Afghanistan, Kandahar province, 4 years ago. The soldiers listened as his words carried across the field. The convoy she was in was ambushed while transporting wounded Marines back to base. A roadside IED detonated beneath the lead vehicle, flipping it into a ditch. The explosion ignited a fire that spread fast. Ammunition started cooking off inside. Everyone was told to fall back. But not her, the colonel paused. Every eye in formation was locked on him. She ran straight into the burning vehicle, alone, flames, shrapnel, smoke. She didn't stop. She pulled out the driver first, then the gunner. When she went back for the third man, the roof collapsed. That's when the metal fragments hit her, shrapnel tearing across her chest and shoulder. She kept moving anyway, dragging that Marine 50 feet to safety before collapsing herself. He turned slightly toward Emily. By the time rescue arrived, she had lost consciousness. They said she shouldn't have survived, but she did. And when she woke up in the hospital 2 weeks later, her first question wasn't about her wounds. It was, did they make it? The field was silent now, the kind of silence that feels sacred. Colonel Harris's voice lowered. All 5 men she pulled from that fire are alive today. 2 are still serving. One of them is standing right here among you. A ripple went through the crowd. Heads turned. Jake's heart started to pound. Harris gestured toward Corporal Ramos, the same soldier who had confronted Jake the night before. Ramos stepped forward, saluted Emily sharply, and said, "Ma'am, permission to speak." "Granted," Emily replied softly. Ramos faced the crowd. "She saved my life that day. I was the gunner. I remember the blast, the heat, the sound of my own screams. I couldn't move. Then I saw her crawling through the flames. I thought I was hallucinating. But she grabbed me, threw me over her shoulder, and dragged me out." His voice trembled slightly. She didn't care about the fire, the pain, nothing. All she cared about was that we lived. He stepped back into formation, and the silence that followed was heavier than before. Jake's throat went dry. His pulse hammered in his ears. The world around him seemed to fade, leaving only the image of the woman he had mocked standing silently at attention, her scars hidden beneath her uniform, scars she'd earned while saving the lives of men just like him. He swallowed hard. Shame burned hotter than the desert sun. Colonel Harris's voice cut through his thoughts. "Those scars aren't shameful. They're proof of courage, the kind most of us only dream of showing. So before anyone dares to laugh, mock, or question another soldier again, remember, some battles leave marks you can see. Others don't, but all of them matter." He looked out over the sea of soldiers. "That's all." Then turning to Emily, he added quietly, "Sergeant, the floor is yours." Emily stepped forward, her gaze steady as it swept across the ranks. "I didn't want this story told," she said. "Not because I'm ashamed, but because I didn't want pity or attention. Every soldier out here fights their own war, some on the battlefield, some inside themselves. My scars are just reminders of mine." Her voice softened. "If you ever see someone carrying their wounds, visible or not, remember this. Survival isn't weakness. It's proof you didn't quit." For a moment, no one moved. Even the wind seemed to pause. Then she said, "That'll be all. Form up for training." But before anyone could move, Jake took a step forward. His face was pale, his jaw tight. He knew every eye was on him, but he didn't care. "Ma'am," he said, voice trembling slightly. "Permission to speak." Emily turned toward him, expression unreadable. "Granted," he swallowed hard. "Yesterday I said something unforgivable. I didn't know who you were. I didn't understand what those scars meant. I thought they were weakness," his voice cracked. "But now I know they're everything I'll never be." The field was deathly still. Emily studied him for a long moment. Then she said, "Lieutenant, the best apology isn't spoken. It's shown. Lead your men with humility. That's how you make it right." Jake nodded, eyes glistening. "Yes, ma'am." He snapped into a salute, sharp, precise, filled with sincerity. And as if moved by an invisible command, 400 soldiers followed his lead, their right hands rising in perfect unison toward their brows. The air vibrated with a sudden wave of respect, awe, and emotion. Emily stood still, her eyes reflecting both pain and pride. She didn't smile, but a quiet strength radiated from her. She returned the salute, slowly, deliberately, her heart heavy but peaceful. As the soldiers dispersed for drills, Jake lingered behind. He approached Emily one last time, voice low. "I was wrong," he said simply. Emily met his gaze. "We all are sometimes. What matters is what you do after." Jake nodded, and for the first time since joining the military, he felt something deeper than pride. He felt humility. As he walked away, Emily looked out toward the horizon. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, the same land that had tested her once before. She ran her fingers over the faint ridge of her scars, whispering to herself, "They don't mock me anymore. They remember. The day after the assembly, the base felt different. The air still smelled of dust and sweat, but something invisible had shifted. A current of respect and reverence that hadn't been there before. Everywhere Sergeant Emily Carter went, heads turned. Soldiers who once looked past her now nodded in silent acknowledgement. Even the newest recruits straightened when she passed, their eyes filled with quiet awe, but Emily didn't crave any of it. She moved through the day as she always had, steady, disciplined, and reserved. Recognition was never what she sought. For her, true honor lived not in salutes or medals, but in the simple act of doing what needed to be done when no one was watching. Still, the weight of the previous day lingered. And for Lieutenant Jake Walker, that weight felt heavier than his own gear. He hadn't slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that burning vehicle described by Colonel Harris, saw her charging into it, defying death itself to save her men. It wasn't just courage. It was self-sacrifice in its purest form. That morning, Jake reported to the training field early before sunrise. The field was empty except for Emily, who was already there, jogging the perimeter in silence, her breath steady and rhythmic. He hesitated for a long time before approaching her. "Sergeant Carter," he called out. She slowed to a stop, turning toward him. Her expression was neutral, neither welcoming nor dismissive. "Lieutenant Walker." Jake swallowed. "I just wanted to say thank you. Not just for what you did out there years ago, but for what you did yesterday. You could have humiliated me in front of everyone, and you didn't." Emily studied him for a moment, then said softly, "You humiliated yourself, Lieutenant. I only gave you the chance to rise from it." He nodded slowly, the truth of her words hitting hard. "Then I intend to do just that." Her gaze softened slightly. "Good. Then let's see it." Later that morning, Colonel Harris announced a special endurance drill, one of the toughest on base. It was a joint combat readiness course, designed to push both Army and Navy personnel to their limits. 4 miles of running, rope climbs, heavy carries, simulated rescue drills, all under the searing desert sun. And this time, Emily would lead the drill herself. "Pair up," she commanded. "Today you win or fail together." As fate would have it, Jake ended up paired with her. A few soldiers exchanged amused glances. The very SEAL who once mocked her now had to keep up with her. The course began with a sprint through rough terrain. Dust filled the air as boots thundered over gravel. Emily moved with controlled precision, every step efficient, every breath measured. Jake struggled to match her pace at first, but his pride refused to let him fall behind. At the halfway point, the group reached the rescue drill, a simulation, requiring each pair to carry a weighted dummy representing an injured soldier over 100 meters of uneven ground. Jake bent down to lift the dummy but slipped slightly on loose dirt. Emily was beside him in an instant, steadying the weight. "Balance your footing," she said calmly. "Control your breathing. Don't fight the burden. Guide it." He nodded, following her lead. Together they lifted the dummy, moving in sync. The strain was intense, shoulders burning, lungs screaming, but neither faltered. By the time they crossed the finish line, they were both drenched in sweat. Emily looked at him and nodded once. "Better," Jake managed a tired grin. "I had a good teacher." Her eyes flickered with the faintest smile before she turned back to the field. "We're not done yet." Hours later, when the last drill ended, the soldiers collapsed under the shade of the tents. Emily stood at the front, hands clasped behind her back, scanning the rows of exhausted faces. "You've all pushed yourselves today," she said, her voice carrying over the field. "Some of you discovered strength you didn't know you had. Some discovered weakness. Both are valuable, because knowing where you stand, that's how you grow." Her words weren't loud, but they carried weight. Every soldier listened. Then Colonel Harris stepped forward, holding a small black case. "Sergeant Carter," he said formally, "Command recognizes your continued service and leadership. You've not only trained these soldiers, you've inspired them. We'd like to honor that." He opened the case, revealing a silver Distinguished Service Medal, one of the military's highest honors. Emily's eyes widened slightly. "Sir, this isn't necessary." "It's overdue," Harris interrupted gently. He handed her the medal, but instead of pinning it on her, he turned to the formation. "When I say attention, you'll know why." He nodded once toward Jake. Jake stepped forward, taking a deep breath. The same man who had mocked her now stood before her, humbled, solemn, transformed. He faced the formation and shouted, voice ringing with authority, Company. Attention. The response was immediate. 400 soldiers snapped to attention. The sound was sharp and synchronized. The thunderous unity of boots striking ground, spines straightening and hearts aligning. Then one by one, they raised their hands in salute. The sight stretched across the entire field. A sea of uniforms and unwavering faces, all turned toward Sergeant Emily Carter. The moment froze in time. Jake stood at the front, his arm raised, his eyes locked on hers. His throat tightened, but his voice remained steady as he spoke softly. "For every scar that carried us home, we salute you." The words echoed across the silence like a prayer. Emily stood there, motionless at first, her chest rising and falling with emotion she could barely contain. She looked across the ranks, met the men and women who once saw only scars, now seeing the story behind them. Her hand rose slowly, returning their salute, crisp, precise, dignified. For 30 seconds, no one moved. No one breathed. It was not just respect. It was atonement. When the salute finally lowered, Emily turned to Jake. "Thank you," she said quietly. He shook his head. "No, Sergeant. Thank you for showing me what real courage looks like." She gave a faint smile. "Courage looks a lot like humility when you learn it the hard way." Jake nodded, his eyes glistening. "Then I guess I'm still learning." "Good," she replied softly. "Never stop." As the sun dipped behind the horizon, painting the sky in deep gold, the soldiers gathered around a campfire near the barracks. Laughter mixed with quiet conversation, the kind that only comes after shared hardship. Emily sat off to the side, watching the flames dance. Jake approached with 2 mugs of coffee. "Permission to sit?" he asked. She gestured to the empty spot beside her. Granted. They sat in silence for a moment before he said, "You know, I used to think strength was about who shouted the loudest or pushed the hardest." "And now?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Now I know it's about who stands back up when the world tries to break them." Emily stared into the fire. "Then you've learned the most important lesson a soldier can." Jake glanced at her scars, visible in the glow of the firelight, and said quietly, "They don't define you." She looked at him, her voice steady. "No, they remind me that I survived." The desert was calm again. The sand shimmered faintly under the morning light, the same light that had witnessed laughter, shame, courage, and redemption over the past few days. The base was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that only follows something unforgettable. The salute from the day before had become legend. Word spread beyond the base, to command posts, military circles even across the branches. Soldiers who hadn't been there spoke about it as if they had, describing the scene in reverent tones. The woman with scars of fire standing tall before 400 saluting soldiers. But for Sergeant Emily Carter, life went back to normal. Or at least her version of it. She rose at 500, ran 5 miles before sunrise, led drills, reviewed reports. She didn't let the attention distract her. She knew admiration was fleeting, but the lesson, she hoped, would last. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere on the base began to change. The SEALs and Army soldiers, once competitive and prideful, began working as one. The tone of the training grounds shifted from arrogance to camaraderie. The men who had once laughed or looked away when someone faltered now reached out a hand to pull their brother or sister back up. And at the center of that transformation stood Emily. She never lectured, never bragged, never reminded them of her past. She simply led by example, through discipline, quiet strength, and an unwavering sense of purpose. Jake Walker, now one of her most dedicated trainees, followed her lead closely. He volunteered for extra drills, took responsibility for younger recruits, and became known for one thing above all: humility. One afternoon, after completing a grueling exercise, Jake approached her with a notebook in hand. "I've been keeping track," he said. "Of what?" she asked, slightly amused. "Every lesson you've taught me," he replied, holding out the notebook. "I figured if I write it down, I'll never forget." She flipped through it, notes scribbled in pencil. Discipline before pride. Respect before strength. Scars don't weaken a soldier, ego does. She smiled faintly. "Looks like you've been paying attention," Jake grinned. "The hard way, maybe. But yes, ma'am." 2 months later, Emily was called to headquarters. She assumed it was for another training report. But when she entered the office, Colonel Harris was waiting with several senior officers. "Sergeant Carter," Harris said with pride, "your leadership here has gone beyond duty. You've reshaped how our soldiers see strength and each other." He stepped aside to reveal a framed commendation on the wall. Her name was etched in gold lettering, "For exceptional courage and exemplary leadership in service." Emily stared at it, momentarily speechless. "Sir, Harris raised a hand. "No speeches, Sergeant. You've earned this not with words but with action." She nodded slowly, emotion flickering in her eyes. As she turned to leave, Harris added, "By the way, Lieutenant Walker recommended it. Said you taught him more in 1 week than he learned in 5 years. That caught her off guard. She smiled softly and said, "Then maybe he's finally learning what leadership means." Later that evening, Jake found her sitting on a bench overlooking the training grounds, the same spot where she had once stood alone after he'd mocked her. The sunset painted the horizon in streaks of gold and crimson. "I heard you got the commendation," he said, sitting beside her. She shrugged. "It's just a frame. Paper fades. Actions don't," he chuckled quietly. "You know, before I met you, I thought leadership was about barking orders and looking tough. Turns out it's about standing in the fire and not flinching." She looked at him sideways. "Sometimes it's about standing in silence and letting someone else learn the hard way." Jake nodded, eyes thoughtful. "You could have ruined me that day." "I didn't have to," she said. "You were already ruining yourself. You just needed a reason to stop." He let out a small laugh. "And you gave me one." They sat quietly for a moment, watching the sun disappear behind the dunes. A few weeks later, the base organized a remembrance ceremony for fallen soldiers, men and women who had given everything in service. Rows of white crosses lined the memorial field. A soft breeze rustled through the flags as the soldiers stood in silence. Emily was among them, dressed in her formal uniform, her medals glinting faintly in the afternoon light. When her name was called to lay a wreath, she stepped forward, her boots crunching softly against the gravel. She knelt at the base of the memorial wall, her fingers brushing over the engraved names she knew by heart. Among them was Sergeant Michael Reeves, one of the men she had saved in that explosion years ago. He hadn't made it home from a later mission. She whispered quietly, "I carried you out once. You carried me ever since." As she stood, she caught sight of Jake standing a few feet away, saluting her silently. For the first time, she allowed herself a small smile, not of pride, but of peace. Months later, Emily received new orders. She was being transferred to lead advanced combat medic training at another base, this time as a full instructor. Before she left, the soldiers gathered for one final assembly. Jake stood at the front representing the unit. "Sergeant Carter," he said, his voice steady but emotional. "On behalf of every soldier here, thank you. You didn't just train us, you changed us." She looked over the faces, men and women who now carried themselves with quiet strength. "If I changed anything," she said, "it's only because you were willing to listen. Remember what I taught you, not with words but with choices." Jake extended his hand. She shook it firmly, then turned to leave. But as she reached the edge of the field, he called out one last time, "Ma'am, company, attention." Once again, 400 soldiers snapped to attention. The sound echoed like thunder against the desert wind. Emily turned, eyes shining, and raised her hand in one final salute. It was the same gesture, the same unity way, but this time it carried no shame, no pain, only gratitude. A year later, on another base miles away, new recruits gathered for their first training session. Their instructor walked to the front, Lieutenant Jake Walker, now promoted, his demeanor calm but commanding. He began with a story. It started with a joke, he said, and ended with a salute. He looked out over the recruits, his voice steady. "There was a soldier who taught me that scars aren't weakness. They're proof of survival. Proof that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, 'Keep going.'" He paused, glancing at the medal pinned to his chest, the one Emily had left behind as a gift before she transferred. "She taught me that leadership isn't about being perfect," he finished softly. "It's about standing tall even when you've been broken." The recruits listened in silence, their expressions solemn. And somewhere far away, under another blazing desert sun, Sergeant Emily Carter led another unit, her voice steady, her scars glinting faintly beneath her uniform. The legacy she left behind was no longer just hers. It had become theirs. Because true courage doesn't fade with time. It multiplies, one soldier, one lesson, one act of honor at a time.